Hello, welcome to Convergent Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very happy and privileged to have talked with Kenneth Harl. Ken is a professor emeritus of classical and Byzantine history at Tulane University. He has his bachelor's in history from Trinity College, master's in history from Yale University, and PhD in history from Yale University. He specializes in ancient history, specifically in classical Anatolia, and on Imperial Roman Coinage. He is the author of many books, including Empires of the Steppes, a history of the nomadic tribes who shaped civilization. And that's what we talk about in the conversation. We start by talking about the origins of nomadic peoples, Tocharian text, and why language is essential for understanding nomadic peoples. We talk about the Turkish language at some length, nomadic spread over 35 centuries, the steppe, what the layout of it was, what its makeup was, and various peoples that were there, and nomadic identity. We discuss the Scythians, the impact of China and the various Chinese dynasties, Kublai Khan, the Uyghurs, the administrative might of the Mongols, the Orkhon Valley in Mongolia, legacy of the nomadic peoples, and many more topics. As many people will know, the steppe region and many nomadic peoples is a very fascinating history for me. I've talked at length about Anatolia and Turkey. I've talked about the Mongols a lot, and many other people groups in the region at various centuries. And this was just a fabulous book to kind of pull it all together and see how they're all connected. I find nomadic peoples deeply interesting. I think it's something that makes us very human from when we walk out of Africa and we explore and we go from place to place and what is it about us that is so curious about doing that? And so, studying and reading about various peoples that have done that, and that's part of their kind of makeup is really, really fascinating and I think interesting, and especially when we see many folks do that today still. So I think there's a lot to learn from these histories and the impact it has for us. Ken was wonderful. He was a really lovely man, very, very brilliant. Everything was just kind of top of mind. He could just pull from and just talk about all of these different points of history. So I really enjoyed our conversation and learning from all of his wisdom. Of course, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at Converging Dialogues. That's substack.com. I'm also on YouTube, so like, subscribe, follow, contribute. All of those things are very, very much appreciated. And now I bring you Kenneth Harl. I am here with Kenneth Harl. Ken, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm greatly looking forward to speaking with you.
Well, I'm very pleased to be here. And as all professors, active and retired, they love to be able to talk. That's how we make our money.
That's great. No, that's good. That's good. I want to download all of the information from you. You've written a marvelous book, Empires of the Steppes, a history of the nomadic tribes who shaped civilization. And it's very, very, very good. I really enjoyed reading it. And it really gives a good it's a good thread throughout time and history of certain characters, but really of nomadic peoples and how they have influenced the world in their time and how they continue to influence many of the places that they roamed. So we'll talk all about it. Before we do, just tell listeners who you are professionally, academically, and what you're currently up to.
Well, I'm a native of the New York City area, and I've always wanted to be a historian from a very young age. I was trained in both classical languages and history, and I retired back in July of 2022 from Tulane after 43 years of teaching.
Wow.
I taught all sorts of courses, Greek, Roman, Byzantine, Viking Age, even did a course on British India. I've always had wide-ranging interests, And most of my scholarly publication is in the Roman Empire. I've also done many courses with the Great Courses or Teaching Company on,
Mm-hmm.
again, long periods of history, trying to give a survey of a civilization or a number of civilizations. And I did one, over 10 years ago on the steppe nomads. And then I was approached by the idea of writing a book on it. And my ideas had changed significantly. You always learn more. You realize that 20, 30 years ago, lecturing, you made all sorts of generalizations that probably cause you to shudder now as new evidence comes out, and your own learning of new sources or sources that you were not aware of. And teaching forces you to compare different civilizations. And the nomads always fascinated me, notably Attila the Hun and Genghis Khan from a young age. And you were taught history, and these people would intrude on the literate urban civilizations periodically. And the question is, well, where did they come from? And why did they burst onto the scene at this particular time? And that's what lured me into accepting the course proposal from the teaching company and then going on to write this book, which again is really a case of my own efforts to try to understand those questions.
Yeah. Well, I think it's really important because of course, we still have some people today that are descendants of some of these ancient peoples. I mean, people will know the bit about Genghis Khan, and 10% of certain people are from his descendants. He was prolific in a lot of ways. And of course, there are many people groups in Turkey, in Anatolia, in Eastern Turkey, in Greece, in the Caucasus regions, and obviously still in the steppe region. So this is I think important history for so much of the world, and definitely still in those countries today. So I think it's always evergreen. So it's great. So to start, I guess is there's this tough thing about trying to find origins. Origins are always like, where's the first? Where are the first kind of peoples and things like that? So you start in the beginning of the book talking about these Tocharian texts, and they're important for the Indo-European language, and then it goes back thousands and thousands of years. So in the Tarim Basin, who are these Tocharians? Who are their ancestors, and how do we know that they come from the European steppes as they are?
Well, the texts themselves date primarily from the 8th through the 10th centuries. You do have some contemporary Chinese sources describing these people as having flaming red hair, light eyes, and there are Chinese illustrations of that. And they've been recovered largely by archaeology, and this would be texts that are translations of well-known Buddhist texts. Those Buddhist texts have been brought into that region centuries earlier. Buddhism shares a similar outlook with Christianity. It's not necessary to have a sacred language, but it is necessary to make the message available. So there are very active efforts to translate the original Buddhist text into the spoken language of that area, and that included at least two languages, Tocharian A and B. There's a suspicion there may have been another. And so you're looking at a language that has been changed and filtered by scribes from somewhere around 800 to, say, 1000 AD. The mummies that were recovered in different excavations and have been subject to DNA push the dates back much earlier. They go into what we call the Bronze Age, anywhere from 1800 to about 1000 BC. The DNA suggests at least two different waves of people. One that shares DNA similarities with people who eventually became Europeans. This would be Indo-European speakers, we surmise, and I make sure that we're surmising this. Also, people who likely came from northern India or Iran at a later date and intermixed. That would fit well with what we know of literary sources. There's constant movement across this area, new people settling in as merchant communities. Um, so the language we have is the equivalent of having Shakespeare and nothing else and trying to surmise, well, how did this language come about? Where did it start 1,000 years earlier? And you don't have Beowulf or Chaucer to help you out. Um, that meant that historical linguistics, people who study language, and particularly Indo European languages, which is a wide family of languages spoken in the world, which shares a number of similarities in its thrust. And as anyone knows who speaks more than one language, that every language is an interpretation of the world. Indo European languages have certain assumptions. The way the verbs should operate. They initially had masculine, feminine, neuter genders. They are very, very conscious of endings on words such as pronouns, nouns, and adjectives to show their function in the sentence. Those would later be dropped and you move to a positional language. And so Tocharian, as it was written in scripts that we could read, immediately revealed itself as an Indo-European language. Well, what is it doing there? Because no one expected to find it there. The best surmise is that somewhere around 3000 BC, that these people who were dwelling on the what we call the South Russian steppes, I often refer to them as the Pontic Caspian steppes, had migrated 1,000 miles east to the grasslands to the west of the Altai Mountains, which acts as the barrier between the central and eastern steppes, in what today would be parts of Kazakhstan. And then there's a subsequent migration into the Tarim Basin. Now, you're trying to match up what we have reconstructed as a Indo-European language with archaeological finds and DNA evidence. And the DNA evidence has been very, very helpful, inclusive, in pointing to the origin of a number of these earlier mummies as somehow they originated in the West and that the movement had been from west to east. That's pretty clearly. Second, this language, which is not related to the languages spoken there now, which is a Turkish language or Chinese that's been brought in, and the Turkish language itself has been greatly modified, the Uyghur Turkish, the East Turkish language. Clearly, this is an earlier language, and the people speaking that had either been assimilated or moved out at some point. So what the language suggests is there are very archaic features in it that they broke away from the other Indo-European languages before the features dominant in the daughter languages we speak today are prominent. There was a division at some point, in the third millennium BC, sometime before 2000, where you broke into a western and southern branch, eastern branch, the centum and the satem, or the kentum and the satem. And that was a result of natural shifts in the way words are pronounced. Vowels and consonants changed to make it easier to say them. And one group of people, if they're isolated from the other group, will on their own learn to pronounce the words more readily. So an initial hard K sound in the Eastern Indo-European languages shifts to a softer sibilant, an S sound, that's sat. These are the words for 100 in Latin and Sanskrit. Well, many of these features that we can document and had been documented for a long time, since the 18th century, they're not in Tocharian, yet it's an Indo-European language. The same was true with the Hittite languages recovered in Asia Minor. They seem to be a very early breakaway from the parent language and evolved on their own in what is now Turkey, changing and being influenced by non-Indo-European languages in their vicinity. And this happens all the time.
Mm.
You think of our own English language, originally a Germanic language, but in vocabulary, it's over 50% Romance. It's Latin, it's French, a lot of Spanish words have been taken in. Um, and people will modify their language in order to express themselves more effectively or to say the words more easily,
Mm.
to enrich it with nouns and concepts that they didn't have and
Mm.
have come about through a number of changes or contacts with other people. So,
Mm.
from what we can tell, Tocharian, the ancestors of the Tocharians, migrated from west to east, and then for various reasons, one speculation is they were pushed into the Tarim Basin by a new wave of migrations, and that would be the so-called Indo-Iranians, who
Mm.
clearly had the chariot and the modern horse,
Mm. Mm.
and may well have had. We just don't know. We have no written records on this, but we surmise that they moved into the Tarim Basin, and from there, they came into contact with Chinese civilization,
Mhm.
and that would also influence them very greatly.
Mm.
So um, that's our best guess of who they
Mm.
are.
Mm.
Again, it's based on DNA evidence of these mummies, and that's pretty conclusive. Nick Patterson and those fellows, they know how to do this stuff. I'm not a historical
Mm.
scientist who can do the different codes, but I certainly can read the results, and they certainly dovetail with my understanding of the evolution of the language.
Mm.
I was
Mm.
trained in Greek and Latin. We had to learn comparative Indo-European linguistics to understand noun and what is it? Consonant and vowel shifts. All of
Mhm.
this is important if you're going to read Homer and you've been trained in Attic Greek, so you have to look at it and say, "Oh yeah, this is the way it was before,"
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
certain
Mhm.
sounds dropped out, and
Mhm.
so you end up learning the techniques of traditional comparative linguistics,
Mm.
and this has been extremely well known since the 18th century, when William Jones was the first to conclude that Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit must come from a
Mm.
single parent.
Mm.
And what
Yeah.
we've been able to do is reconstruct some of the vocabulary, the grammar, and the syntax of the original Indo European language, usually called Proto Indo European. Scholars
Mm.
always like to protect themselves with
Mhm.
proto,
Mhm. Mhm.
PIE. And
Mhm.
it's not really a language, it's a reconstruction of the skeleton of the language. Uh,
Mm.
and it's based on comparing the various daughter languages and how did they change.
Mm.
Um, and based on that, you can fit Tocharian into that language family, and it clearly left at a relatively early date. And the Anatolian languages seem to be second. And
Mm.
then there's this split between the East and West. Um, the languages of Iran and India are carried eastward. They're related to the Slavic languages that remain on the eastern steppes and move into the forest zones of Russia. And then you have the Western language family that eventually colonizes most of Europe, uh,
Mhm.
giving rise
Mhm.
to most of the languages of Europe today. Um, and
I think here it's interesting that some people may be asking, well, why the emphasis on language? And I think that my understanding of this is that I mean, just as it is today, but I mean, maybe more salient in some ways, is to communicate, right? I mean,
yeah,
many people in these times they weren't literate, they weren't reading and writing and things like that, and so there's this idea of how do you speak, how do you communicate, and knowing something about the languages and certainly the kind of way in which languages evolve and shift and move tells you maybe a little bit something about the groupings of people and where they're coalescing with other groupings of people and over which time and place and all that. And so it does become particularly instructive to say, okay, how do we how are we able to show how people, here's what we understand about the language, and what would show what people how people were talking to each other or suspecting how they were talking to each other and why it's important.
I've mentioned many times, being in a bilingual marriage, you realize that you're dealing with interpretations of the world. My wife is primarily a Turkish speaker, and that is not an Indo-European language. It belongs to a very different language family. And any group of people have to come to some kind of conclusions of how do we express concepts? How are verbs to function? What is the word order? What do we need to convey abstract meanings, such as what we would call relative clauses, subordinate clauses? I am speaking to a podcaster who is recording me. Well, in Turkish, you don't have that relative pronoun. And my wife got very confused when she was learning English because they have interrogative pronouns, who is this? So she's wondering, why are you asking a question in the middle of the sentence? And because this would be expressed in a verbal construction in Turkish very efficiently. Also, how are you going to designate plurals? Are you going to just have singular and plural, or are you going to have a dual indicating two, which is true in early Indo-European languages and drops out in most of them later on, but is certainly a feature of ancient Greek. So,
Can you talk a little bit since we're on it about the Turkish language? So if there's the split from the Anatolian languages, but my understanding is that the Turkish language is interesting because there's a lot of the Turkish language that's preserved from many centuries ago, but then post Ottoman into the modern period, there was another big reshift in how the Turkish language is. Could you maybe just tell us about the Turkish language, about that?
It is, our documentation of it is fairly late. It comes from these inscriptions in the 8th century AD, which are in what is now Mongolia, in the Orkhon Valley, which is an extremely beautiful setting, and its mountains were always seen as sacred to Tengri, the Lord of the eternal sky. And the Turkish languages, the Western branches and the Eastern branches, are much closer to each other than many of the Indo-European languages that diverged long ago and have developed on their own. So a modern Turkish speaker in the Republic of Turkey, where 50% of all Turkish speakers exist today, they could understand the Turkish of the Azerbaijanis or Turkmenistan pretty well. My wife would think it's kind of funny, but it's understandable. And the Azerbaijani Turkish is regarded as a wonderful dialect for pop music in Turkey. So if you don't know the dialect, you emulate it in order to get popular ratings with your song. And as you get farther east, the languages have modified more in, say, Kazakhstan. And the Uyghur language in Xinjiang or Uyghurstan, depending on what you want to call it, the Tarim Basin, I use that as a neutral term, that has been modified even more. And that would be harder for them to understand. But the languages stayed much closer together than the Indo-European languages did, because people settled over a wide area. They intermixed with other people. The languages have evolved on their own. A literary tradition emerged. And what happened to Turkish when it entered the Islamic world, they shifted from an early alphabetic system that we see on those monuments in what is now Mongolia, but was used elsewhere. We have evidence of them used as far west of what is now Bulgaria and Hungary, with the Arabic script, which was not a particularly good script for rendering the Turkish language. Also, they were very heavily under the influence of the literary dominance of Iranian, Persian. So Ottoman Turkish, as used by the governing classes of the Ottoman Empire, was a gobbledygook of Arabic, Turkish, and Iranian. And even today, in modern Turkish in Turkey, I can sense, well, this really isn't an original Turkish construction. This is a syntax. They probably took it from Iran. There's various words
Mm,
you see. Those are obviously Arabic loan words.
mm,
Enormous number of French words entered into
mm.
modern Turkish because Ataturk really loved Paris and had some nice French mistresses, and you know. French was seen as the premier language of Europe. Now, of course, they're borrowing English words and technology and the like. And
Mhm,
in 1928, in order to achieve literacy, Ataturk and the reformers, and these reforms had been proposed for at least two generations, junked the Arabic script, went to the Roman script, created a very efficient alphabet and a
mm,
spelling system that is very logical and fits
mm,
very nicely the Turkish language, and achieved stunning results in literacy, where you
mm,
had in 1928 a largely illiterate peasant population that by 1945 you had a significantly illiterate population. People were accustomed to reading newspapers, um, printed books. And the result was a major reform of the language, removing many Persian and Arabic,
mm.
uh,
Wow,
creating new words from Turkish roots, and
wow.
really modifying the language that to learn Ottoman Turkish is a highly specialized skill. It's the way a modern English speaker has to learn Beowulf. Uh,
Mm, mhm, mhm,
it's and one of the reasons Ataturk did this, and in my opinion, and it's not this, other scholars would say the same, is it would remove the Turks from the influence of Arabic and the overwhelming power of the Quran, because in Islam you can't translate the Quran. You can only translate its meaning. A true believer needs to learn Arabic and master it.
right,
And that's
right.
because Ataturk wanted to push Turkey into Europe and
Mhm. Yeah, it's more
this more
secularization of
secular,
sorts. Right, right.
society. And my wife, being a modern Turkish speaker, she doesn't read Arabic. She she
Mhm.
and she uses the Roman script. Thankfully, it made her learning English so much easier. You have to learn a new
Yeah.
alphabetic system,
Right, right.
which
No,
is
that's very,
extremely
very, very.
helpful.
Yeah, yeah. It's very, that's very, very helpful. That's nice. I like the explanation. I've read different things about it. Ataturk obviously is, obviously well revered there in Turkey for good reason. So you talk about a variety of groups. So I'm going to speed us along here.
Uh-huh.
By 500 BC, we have over 35 centuries, up to this point, that
Yeah.
European nomads had spread
Mhm.
across Europe and into India. And
And
so
the
you
Middle
have
East.
Anatolians, you have the,
Yeah.
uh-huh. Yeah, 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 yeah. You have Tocharians, Indo-Aryans, Persians. The Hittites were there, and they had come and gone. How did these nomads spread pretty much of the known world at that time? I mean, again, 35 centuries is a long time, but there's a big spread, and there's this kind of presence of um, these nomadic peoples leaving their mark in certain places. What is just kind of big 30,000 foot view perspective here? What's that kind of picture that we're seeing of this happening?
Well, first, they had incredible mobility because of the mastery of the horse, the chariot, and the wheel, as it's sometimes been summarized. And that's a very important
Mm,
work dealing with it that everyone makes use of. That gave them the mobility to move across the steppes. And then I always say the steppes have different exit ramps. I mean, if you look at the geography, the steppes will take you, if you move east, it'll take you to the Great Jaxartes River. In some ways, it's similar on the other side. You have grasslands, but it also permits agricultural communities to flourish and cities. And so the nomadic peoples move into there. They quickly come to terms with urban populations. Perhaps they provide them horses, they can hire out as mercenaries, as soldiers. In some cases, if they're in sufficient numbers, they end up as conquerors. Um,
mm,
so there's a variety of ways in which they will penetrate into the urban and agricultural zones as immigrants,
mm,
as refugees trying to escape another tribe that has taken them and appropriated their homeland, or under a charismatic leader who can put together a great confederation as conquerors.
Mm,
Invariably, they are a minority when they
mm,
arrive in many of these locations, especially if they're cities. But you have a number of instances of a minority essentially assimilating a majority. I think that's what happened to the Hittites in Asia Minor, one of the first
mm,
uh, Indo European speakers who had moved out of the South Russian steppes to the southwest, crossed the lower Danube, which is the traditional route of entering the Balkans, and then crossed again the Bosporus and the Dardanelles and spread across Asia Minor. The majority of
mm,
the people of the Hittite Empire in, say, 1500 BC were descended from people who were there before the speakers of the Indo European languages ever arrived. But over time, they learned the language of the conquerors. That was your passport to advancement. Um, if you were engaged in commerce, all these people have to have several different languages. There's intermarriage, the Hittite languages, and there were a series of Anatolian languages, not just Hittite, but also Luvian,
mhm,
Palic, and very recently a fourth one has been detected among the cuneiform texts that have come down to us. Uh,
mm,
and what happens is the some people call it more of a Creole language, that the original Indo-European language becomes a mixture. Um,
mm,
it still retains the Indo-European syntax, the verb structure and all, but enriches itself with new vocabulary, intonation could easily
mm,
change. There'll be sound changes brought about by non-Indo-European speakers or simplification. um, Good example would be the Germanic language of Anglo-Saxon compared to the Old Norse language, where the Anglo-Saxon language, Old English, because it's spoken by many more people, including um, probably originally Celtic speakers who are assimilated, that it simplifies. Um,
mm,
whereas Norse retains all of its eccentricities and complexities. The same would be true of the Greek of Athens, spoken in the 5th century BC, a highly subtle language. But when Alexander the Great conquers his known world and Greek becomes the lingua franca of commerce and intellectual activity and government, it simplifies into the Koine Greek of the New Testament. Um,
mm,
so certain elements of the language are lost. New vocabulary comes in. The non-native speakers help influence the simplification of the language,
mm,
and this is a common trait. Um, Turkish, for the longest time, retained its purity because it was spoken by so many nomadic peoples, and
mm.
nomadic peoples tend to reinforce each other with their traditional language. And then when they have to deal with the outsiders, they always have someone who can act as a translator, usually women.
Mm.
They're smarter than men anyway. So the best simultaneous translators are generally women. So in any event, they can communicate with the Chinese or to the Persians or Western Europeans, but then they spend the bulk of their time among themselves, speaking their traditional language and maintaining and teaching it. So they may not have a written form, but it retains its conservative nature for a longer time. And that's what happened to the Turkish languages. They
Mm,
kept much more cohesiveness among themselves. Now they are changing. They're now in written form. You know, you have nation states,
mm,
Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan. Some of them use the Roman alphabet. Some of them use the Cyrillic. Um, Uyghur Turkish is probably pretty incomprehensible to my wife. It's
mm,
too far removed. But considering the differences of Russian and French,
mhm,
they haven't diverged nearly as much as the Indo-European
mm,
languages because those migrations were much earlier. Um,
mm,
they came into contact with different civilizations. They adopted literacy at different times, uh,
yeah.
and um, and so when you look at those inscriptions from the 8th century AD, and my wife does, and when they're put in the Roman script, she can still recognize it as somehow her language, which is
That's fascinating.
remarkable.
Yeah,
because
yeah,
it's
yeah.
contemporary with Beowulf. And
Yeah,
most modern English
that's
speakers looking at, unless they know German, look at it and say, "What the heck is this?"
yeah, no, I
I
couldn't
have
do
no
I
idea
couldn't
what this guy
I have
was
no
talking
idea what it's saying. It's literally a different language.
about.
For for listeners, tell us I guess about the excuse me, geographically. My understanding is you have the eastern steppe that is basically Mongolia,
Yeah.
modern day Mongolia, and in and around modern day China.
Mhm.
And then you go all the way across and you have the Western steppe, which is modern day Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, crosses into Ukraine, etc. And then it goes all the way where they become, it's not necessarily continuous. I think the Caucasus Mountains have a
Right.
break there. The Persians in Iran have a break there, but it does. What's also included is some of the Balkan regions in modern day Bulgaria, maybe Romania, and then obviously Central Anatolia in Turkey. So yeah, you can divide it by north, south, east, west, or however you want. But what's the when we talk about the steppe, what is the makeup of it, and then aligning it with
Well, it stretches,
current nation states for
yeah,
people.
thousands of miles across Eurasia. A good deal of it is now controlled by Russia.
Hmm.
But it's sandwiched between the Tigra to the north, the woodland districts, and beyond that, the permafrost. And to the south, there may be desert, or the steppes will move into this mixed area of well-watered regions. Transoxiana is the traditional word. That today would be largely Uzbekistan, where you have great river valleys that could support cities and irrigation, but you also have vast grasslands, which is ideal for the pastoral life of nomads. So you get this mixed settlement. If you were on the area where we think horses were originally domesticated, which would be stretching from the lower Danube to, say, the Volga, um, and to the north, you have the woodlands of Russia. And along the southern rim, you have the Black Sea, and farther east, the Caspian Sea, the northern uh, shores of the Caspian Sea, um, and the Caucasus Mountains dividing the steppe zone from the Middle East. In that region, we believe is where this peculiar nomadic way of life emerged. The herding of animals, the movement according to the seasons, and they moved in different directions. To the south and west, there are these grassland zones that are extensions of the steppes. You mentioned Moravia, Transylvania, Hungary. Um, that is sort of an exit ramp, moving off the steppes into um, more of a Balkan or Central European climate. If you cross the Caucasus and you hook right, you will end up on the Anatolian Plateau, an area very well known to me, having spent much time in Turkey. And that's like a
Mm,
mini steppe in the middle of a Mediterranean peninsula, and
right,
nomads would
right.
instinctively like settling there. On
Sure.
the other hand, if they went south or to the east, they would enter into Mesopotamia, Iraq, or into Iran, Western Iran, and these would be very different climates to them, and their way of life would invariably change. Um, when the Turks burst into the Islamic world, they cross that river, the Jaxartes. They enter into Transoxiana, today Uzbekistan, that mixed area. But as they march
Mm,
west, they enter into the agricultural zones and cities of the Islamic world. And there they are greatly outnumbered. They're not particularly happy to be there. Um,
mm,
Turkish warriors in cities have a tendency to latch on to things and clash with the local citizens. And the Turks were always seen as hard masters by their their Muslim subjects, and they got a pass simply because they were technically Muslim. But when they
mm,
enter into the Byzantine Empire and take control of Anatolia, well, I understand that interior. Well, this is a place to settle. We can herd
mm,
our animals here. We understand the landscape, and they very quickly
mm,
adapt to that. Um,
Mm,
as you go farther east, again, you have the Taran Basin, which is sandwiched between the Great Tibetan Plateau, which really only the Tibetans can live in until modern times. And they are tough people. You're not going to take them on easily. And to the north, desert and steppe zones. And this is the linchpin between the Middle East and China. You go through the
mm,
Jade Gate and you enter China. You have the Gobi and the arid areas, the Ordos region of the Yellow River, that acts as something of a barrier. But then you have those eastern steppes defined by the Altai Mountains to the west
mm,
and the foothills of Manchuria to the east. And
mm,
that is where the Turkish language, the Mongol languages evolved, the Altaic languages, and then they spread west later in historic periods in the Middle Ages.
mm,
Um,
mm,
one of the reasons in writing the book was essentially following geography.
mm.
Geographically, the migrations are going to go from west to east in the earlier period in antiquity, but from
And
the
then
Middle
back.
Ages, they reverse
Mhm.
and they go from east
Yeah,
to west, and that
yeah,
leads to the language distribution you see over all of the Middle East and Central Asia today.
yeah. It's very fascinating how it starts, it goes to east, and then comes back. It's a very interesting kind of rhythm to how that happens. So I guess with that, I'm curious. uh, You mentioned it somewhere in the book. I was curious for your thoughts on this. This idea about um, nomadic identity, which is really interesting. I feel like there's definitely for many people in these nation states now, there's traces of that, or there's
Mhm.
kind of these echoes or ripple effects. If people have met folks from Uzbekistan or Turkey, or
Mhm.
you'll see traces of this, right? But yeah, you mentioned that nomadic identity was more of a common language. So we talked
Mhm.
about the Turkish language. It could be other languages as well. Culture and shared historical experiences, rather than this, racial
Right.
descent and where did you stay and come from and all that. Talk about that, about this nomadic identity, how it was linked with these kind of few things, and I guess how that kind of persists. I think that's a really interesting
Well,
kind of
I'll
element
give
here.
you an anecdote that
Yeah,
um,
yeah, please.
that was often expressed when um, a people came to terms with Genghis Khan or his grandsons. Um, they would receive kumish, which is the fermented mare's milk, and salt,
Mm,
taking service. And the statement would be, "You are now Mongols. You
mm,
have You've accepted the service of the great Lord. You entered his service. You are now one of us. It doesn't matter that you were a Turkic speaker or an Iranian speaker or whatever. You're now part of that Mongol community." And the armies of Genghis Khan, probably three-quarters of them spoke some kind of Turkish language, at least among the horsemen. Of course, they
mhm,
enrolled many other types of allies as time went on. And that is the practicality of the nomadic peoples. As they would move, not the great campaigns of Genghis Khan or Tamerlane or Attila the Hun, but as they move seasonally or driven to move farther than their usual patterns because of drought, changes of weather, local conditions, they would encounter other nomadic peoples and they'd have to come to terms with them. They'd have to work
mm,
out easement arrangements. They'd have to work out, well, what are the water sources going to be like? This could lead to conflict, or more likely, it would lead to some kind of understanding. There would be marriage alliances between the two groups. And this is what happened in the early Middle Ages. As Turkish groups moved westward, they encountered Iranian speaking nomads, and these types of deals were cut. And over time, groups would amalgamate through guest friendship, through marriage, through personal friendships. And the group would determine, well, this is the language we're going to use. And so Iranian speakers increasingly becoming familiar with the Turkic language. So, well, what the heck? We might as well simply speak this language. It makes it easier for everyone. And I think it
mm,
would be that kind of practicality that led to these communities fusing around a language and agreeing this is our language. And once you've done that, you've accepted an interpretation of the world. This is the way
Yeah.
you see and express the world. Um,
Mm.
the pattern of life between Iranian nomads and Turkic nomads wouldn't have been that different. So they would have
Hmm.
that shared experience. And then they would have the shared experience of moving together and having, in my demented sense of responsibility, taken American undergraduates across Turkey on academic excursion twice in my career for a month. They really did fuse into a traveling group. I mean, we used to call them the Anatolians.
That's
So
funny.
we would start in Istanbul and end in Ankara, and each student had to give a German referat, a report on site, and they traveled for a month together across the Anatolian landscape. And those common experiences fuse them into an
Mm.
identity. And this is true with all migrating peoples. Um,
Yeah.
it'll be celebrated in song, in legend.
Hmm.
And especially if they're illiterate, this would be oral poetry that would be transmitted, embroidered, passed on as examples. And it would be those types of communal celebrations of poetry at feasts or marriages or
Mm.
other great events, the burial of a significant member of the community, which would draw them together and create a culture built around the language, around the common experiences, even though these people might have a number of different sources in terms of their DNA.
Mm.
That's not that important. And all of this is often uh, connected with coming to terms with a new group of people through marriage alliances and the like. And these were
Mm.
going on constantly across
Mm.
the steppes. And
Mm.
it led to a population that was fairly diverse in appearance,
Hmm.
in the languages being modified, but also in the cultures being enriched, and a better survival strategy on a landscape that doesn't permit mistakes.
Hmm. Hmm.
You've
Hmm.
got to be able to know where the water sources are, to find shade and rest in the blazing sun, to store up provisions for brutal winters. Ibn Fadlan, who was the envoy to the Bulgars and the Khazars in 922, and his account was used for the novel by Michael Crichton, the Eaters of the Dead, which became the movie The
Mm.
13th Warrior.
Hmm.
Um, the best part of the work is not so much talking about the Rus on the Volga, but on his own experience of traveling across the central steppes in the dead of winter, and how the hospitality of those Turkish people
Mm.
um, and the tightness of those communities enabled him and his fellow travelers from the Arabic world to survive. Uh,
Mm. Mm.
and it's one of the best accounts of how the Turks lived really prior to their conversion to Islam. And it's now available in a very, very convenient English translation in the Penguin series.
Mm.
Previously, you'd have to read it in a French translation if you didn't know the Arabic. Uh, it's a marvelous read. Uh,
I I
but
I think the anecdote you told I think was really nice because I think it shows that there's there's this there's this sort of connective tissue between different nomadic groups. You're talking about Uzbekistan and then folks from Turkey. That it's like, yeah, it's similar maybe in language and maybe a little bit in appearance, but there is differences here. And I think that there's a kind of beauty in that, right? Of not being
Mhm.
so obsessive about racial identity or what's your DNA say or what's your bloodline. And I think there's a
Mhm.
kind of beauty in that, of this kind of how you're able to, if you got to find, how do we survive on the tundra? How do we survive in the winter? How do we find where the
Yeah,
where the next watering hole is? Well, I don't really care what
I
your
don't
what your
care what your
DNA
DNA
says. Yeah,
is.
I need you to help me out here. But I
Yeah,
think that kind of collective experience is super super. I don't want to say, I don't want to overplay it. I don't want to say it's unique. I think there might be places obviously where that happens too, but I think distinct is some to
Distinct is
some
a good
component.
word, and not all human communities, think that way. Even among settled communities, the two civilizations I devoted my life to are ancient Greece and Rome,
Yeah.
and they're similar in a number of ways, and that very, very distinct. And in that regard, Greek democracy, that we really mean Athenian democracy, but the Greek city-state is very much based on descent. They
Yeah.
don't give out citizenship to
Hmm.
foreigners. They may give you a legal status, but you're not going to be a citizen. Romans,
Mm-hmm.
on the other hand, are pragmatic as your nomad. We, to be a Roman is, well, you speak Latin, and, when you have to, you wear a toga, that ungainly garment on political, and you're loyal to Rome. And being a Roman is a series of political and legal rights. It
Hmm.
has nothing to do with descent. And that's what originally the American Constitution is based on. It's based on the Roman concept of citizenship. And I think steppe nomads would understand and appreciate that Roman outlook. Yeah, it's
Hmm.
just being practical. We need
Yeah.
people. And if
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
prove they're loyal, who cares what
Yeah.
their
Hmm. Hmm.
ancestors were, or
Hmm.
whether we even fought them back in the past? They're now
Hmm.
Romans. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and and that, it's an outlook. Some people share that outlook, and other people share the outlook of, well, it's exclusive, it's really
Mm.
only for us. And then in religious terms it becomes, well, only the true believers will be saved, the
Mhm.
rest of the world is
Mhm.
condemned. I, as I always like to say, having taught early Christianity, I like the origin view, in that we're all going to be saved despite ourselves.
Yeah,
Because if there's a
yeah,
heaven, that's the only way I'm going to get
that's
in.
that's very far away from that in modern
Yeah,
days,
yeah. I mean, it's
unfortunately.
just, uh,
Very different
yeah.
now.
As an
So
American of many different nationalities, I mean, I prefer the nomadic definition.
that's a better one. So I want to give a little bit of time because I one of the really nice things about the book is we won't cover all of it, of course, but given a little bit of time and light to some of the lesser known uh, peoples and groups and things that happen. You give a good amount of the interaction with the Chinese and
Mhm.
various, which I think is important. I think a lot of people don't give a lot of time to that. I'm sure people in their respective fields do, but when we read a lot about in popular books or whatever, less of that. So, but I do want to ask about, you talk about Darius, or some people might know from other accounts, but the Scythians, they were the first one of the big groups to kind of
Mhm.
attack. Now I know Chris Beckwith has written a fabulous book on the Scythian Empire.
Mhm.
Uh, the Scythians seem to be a kind of like a precursor group to all of these other groups we know afterwards. Tell us about them, how mixed they were
Yeah.
with Eastern Iranian, Soviet, Russian, Ukrainian. Like they're kind of on that higher end of the step, but they were a more ancient people group, pre-Persian. So yeah, tell us about the Scythians and how they became more intermixed, especially in Iran.
Well, they are probably the ones most responsible for the success of the mounted horse archer becoming.
Mm,
Uh, they're involved in that paradigm shift, moving from chariot warfare to mounted warriors, which clearly had been affected by the opening of the Iron Age. And I think it gave them that advantage to spread across what we would call the Western and Central steppes. Um, and then they would be at the Jaxartes River, and whether it's the Persian Great King or later Alexander the Great, they would then have to come to terms with, well, how are we going to secure this border against different Scythian tribes? Um, they would have also had under their control, there was some kind of high king, at least on the western steppes. Um, there are several names reported in the Greek sources who would have also had agriculturalists as their subjects. These would be people dwelling in the river valleys of what is now Ukraine and parts of Russia. Um, their ancestry is unknown.
mhm,
The descriptions of them as well as the excavations of these kurgans, which suggests that, again, you're dealing with a mixed population. Many of them would have had reddish hair, fairish complexion. Um, these would be genetic traits that would be associated with more northern climate, whatever their origins were. As you got farther to the south and east, there would be intermixture with people from the Middle East. Um, and you would show that same mixed set of ancestry you found in the Tarim Basin mummies, I'm sure.
Mm, mm,
Um, they would have spoken a series of related languages, and as you move from west to east, those languages would become farther and farther apart. But we don't know if they had writing. There's no
mm,
evidence that they had writing.
yeah.
And this marks them as different from many of the Eastern nomadic peoples that we hear about later, where being in close proximity to Chinese civilization, they very quickly pick up the fact that writing is extremely useful.
Mm,
And at the very least, we're going to hire a bunch of Chinese scribes who can keep records for us because
mm,
we can collect tribute and we have all sorts of advantages with it.
mm,
The Scythians probably did not have writing. They did come into contact with Greeks on the northern shores of the Black Sea, and there was an intermixture there. And they would have seen Greeks keeping records, but they didn't have direct contact with a great bureaucratic monarchy equivalent to China.
mm,
Um, and even the Persian nobility that ran the great empire of Darius, writing and reading, well, that's something for a bunch of scribes. And anyway, they keep the records in Aramaic. We're warriors. We do the fighting.
right.
We're not going to mess with that schoolboy stuff. So for whatever reasons, they didn't adopt writing, or if they did, we have no trace of it.
Mm,
Um, on the other hand, they would have been a very, very successful confederation of a group of inner tribes around the High King. And this would be the man who would get the kind of burial ceremonies that Herodotus describes, where a
mm,
great kurgan is raised, there is a sacrifice of horses and humans, which are then stuck up on poles around the grave. Uh, there would be rich gifts put in the monumental architecture. And they did have impressive wealth for the elite classes because they were so important in controlling the trade between the Black
mm,
Sea and the Baltic, uh, points farther east. They could furnish horses, especially to the people of the Middle East, horses that were strong enough to be used as war horses or could be bred for mules, all sorts of products of the steppes. Um, Furthermore, they were very useful to hire as your border patrol.
mm,
Uh, if they're going to cross the borders anyway in search of trading, and if you shut down the trading, they're going to raid, well, why not hire some of them as your border patrols and settle them as military colonists? So,
mm,
always along the settled frontiers, there's these mixed societies of nomadic and settled peoples in which many qualities of the nomadic society emerge. That is, they tend to be martial societies. There's great stress on writing, the importance of riding, the importance of archery and athletic exercises.
mm,
Diet will be affected. They all drink different types of yogurts and
mm,
fermented mare's milk and the like.
mhm,
And and this is what happens in North China. This is what happens on the northeastern frontiers of the Iranian world, and what happens on the eastern edges of what becomes the Roman Empire too.
mm, mm.
That you get these mixed societies. Um, uh, Again, it's hard to characterize the Scythians as a single race,
Yeah, 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 yeah. That's
and
my understanding of it, is that there's a lot of mixture. Excuse me, and because they don't have this kind
constantly.
of writing, at least not as advanced as maybe other groups. It makes it a little bit hard to kind of pin down. I guess the thing here I want to ask is, since we're on this, is you have in Iran the is it Arsid kings of Parthia? Uh,
The Achaemenid kings are Persians. The Arsacid that's
Yes.
the royal family of the Parthians, and they
Yeah.
they emerged in the middle of the third century BC. Yeah.
Yeah. So they're descendants of the Scythians, no? Or
They are
is that
related to them
assumed?
ultimately, yeah, because they are probably East Iranian speakers who had
Mm-hmm.
moved into the borderlands between Iran and Uzbekistan today.
Mm,
Um, and they were subject by Alexander the Great. It was very nominal
mm,
control. And in the breakup of Alexander's empire and the generations after his death, where you have these competing kingdoms headed up by Macedonian dynasties, the Parthians are able to declare their independence and then emerge as a power in the
mm-hmm.
second century BC because
Mm-hmm.
Seleucid power is on the decline.
Mm-hmm.
And they take over most of what is now Iran, parts of Afghanistan,
Mm-hmm.
Mesopotamia, Iraq,
Yep.
and then clash with the Romans.
Yeah, this is really where we see the Persian Empire, and then you have hundreds of years of Rome and Persia going at it,
Yeah.
fighting some peace. And if my memory serves correctly, it really is the induction of a third player in the seventh century, namely Islam. It kind of
Yeah,
comes on
no
the
one
scene, and
expected that.
yeah, right. Out of Arabia, all of a sudden you have this very dominant force. They get into Arabia, they go through Syria, and it's like, whoa. And so, sort of kind of this third player here kind of breaks that up. So I wanted to highlight that. So tell us about the Chinese story here. You spend various chapters talking about this. I thought this was important because again, gets uh, less of the spotlight here. Um, just generally, and then you can talk about Bao Chao, you can talk about Modu Chanyu, you can talk about all these different players here if you want. But you know, we'll get to the Orkhon Valley in Mongolia a little bit, which is a very fascinating place. But Mongolia is where we see a lot of activity, a lot
Mhm.
of space for many nomads. Obviously, you have the Mongol Empire, etc. But there's, it is bordered with modern day China and even historical China. There's all these, dynasties that are here. What's the story here? The interaction between peoples of the steppe, the nomadic peoples, with the Chinese, and how, for maybe in the early periods, maybe in the in the first or second century BC, how were they interacting with these nomadic peoples and really able to kind of interact with them positively or sometimes negatively? What's the kind of story there, I guess?
Well, the unification of China by Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor, who's um, unifies six major Chinese states in
Mm,
221 BC. Um, he dies in 210 BC, and he's known best for his mausoleum at Mount Li and the excavation of the terracotta warriors that have been reconstructed. They were all damaged, apparently, in a fire um, set during the civil wars that led to the downfall of his dynasty just 5 years after his death.
mm,
But nonetheless, his unification of China and his construction of the Great Wall, and we'll have to explain what the Great Wall was in his time. It was not
uh-huh.
what you see today.
Mm-hmm.
But that notion of defining China as the Middle Kingdom and marking a boundary between the northern peoples on the steppes and the settled Han peoples, um, the people of China, that actually galvanized the different nomadic tribes to organize. And it's interesting that it's the year after the death of the first Chinese emperor, that Modu Chayu, um, murders his father at an archery demonstration of all things. He's showing off his bodyguard and then orders him to shoot his father, and takes over the throne and unites the various nomadic tribes into a confederation. And this is done because nomadic peoples realize that they must trade with the sedentary civilizations on their borders if they are to prosper. Now, if you look at the world from their viewpoint, Now, it's not a map-oriented north. They're on the north looking around them.
Mm.
And they see all of these cities and more numerous people who have goods and products which they themselves can't produce. This would include all sorts of vegetables and fruits, bread, wine. It would include technology, ceramics, weapons. In the case of China, silk. In the case of Rome, gold. All sorts of prestige items as well as practical items. And the only way to obtain them is either by trade or, if they refuse to trade, by raiding. Well, the consolidation of China into an effective empire, and it really is an incredible empire, the mobilization of labor to build those fortifications on the northern frontier, and the labor that went into this incredible mausoleum of the first emperor and all these thousands of terracotta warriors, meant that they could dictate terms that could be extremely detrimental to the Xiongnu and other nomadic peoples. And so there was strength and unity in order to extort better terms. I don't think Modu Chinu or any of those conquerors up until maybe Genghis Khan or Attila the Hun, perhaps, but most of them don't think of overthrowing China. What they want is a relationship with China where they can assure the arrival of products. Chinese brides are always nice. You know, Chinese emperor is polygamous. He's got all sorts of concubines. He's got lots of extra daughters around. It's useful to be the brother-in-law of the man who has the mandate of heaven because it allows you to impress upon your own people and your subject tribes that you are the great leader. So the unification of the Xiongnu is in part a response to the unification of China. Some scholars would go so far as to argue that Imperial China and the nomadic imperial confederations are really codependent on each other in some ways. Immediately, the Han emperors, Gaozu, the first emperor of the Han dynasty in 205 BC, within a couple of years realizes trying to wage a war north of the wall is logistically extremely difficult.
Sure.
There's no percentage in it in terms of income. It's better to come to terms. And he devises the diplomacy that is pursued by most Chinese emperors, really down to the Mongol conquest, which is the so-called five baits. We offer brides, access to Chinese markets. In return, the nomads will provide us horses, perhaps warriors. And this would be a far cheaper and more efficient way of coming to terms with these people. In any case, the emperor in China sees the regions to the north really as the most important thing it provides are horses. China cannot breed its own horses for warfare. It doesn't have the soil conditions that gives the nutrients in the fodder, and therefore you have to get your horses from the north. Otherwise, the real action is in the Yangtze, in developing the rice paddies, the silk, and the expansion is really directed south. That's where the future of China is, and that's where the bulk of Chinese people come to live, certainly by 500 AD. And this changes with the Emperor Wu Di, who comes to the throne in 140, dies in 87 BC, has an extremely long reign, and he finds these terms humiliating for China and decides, no, we are going to fight the Xiongnu. And he thinks in long-term strategic terms, it doesn't matter if it takes 30 years, but eventually we will prevail. It is the reason why he sends that envoy of his, Zhang Qian, west, who gets captured by the Xiongnu and gives the Chinese their first report about the western regions. But starting with Wu Di, the Chinese emperor wants to subordinate, defeat, some would argue in some instances wage veritable genocide against the nomadic tribes to remove the threat. That forced China to put itself on a war footing. It drew them west to control the western regions, which is today Uyghurstan, or the Tarim Basin, to ensure the trade routes, get them out of the hands of the nomads. And it committed the Han Empire to a 200-year struggle with the Xiongnu. And eventually they prevailed. The Xiongnu Confederation broke up in 53 BC into a northern and southern confederation. The Northern Confederation was seen as the enemies. The Southern Confederation, well, those tribes could be put on the Chinese payroll. But over time, what happened is the Chinese emperors of the Han Dynasty, the later Han Dynasty, after 25 AD, increasingly made use of nomadic warriors, settled them on the frontiers, and after 220, these tribes, well armed, with Chinese officials, went into business for themselves. And
Mm.
you get the split between North China and South China, the China of the Yangtze, where the rice production, the population, and the cities will come to rest, and the northern zones where the Chinese are in constant interaction with nomadic peoples, and that's where you recruit your warriors. And this division of North-South China will persist, well, into the Mongol period and beyond. Um, there are periods of unity. The Tang emperors in the 7th century reunite China into a great state, and the Emperor Taizong is the only ruler of any sanitary civilization who ever conquers the actual homeland of the nomads. And the reason is he's a product of that northern martial society. He knows how to ride, he knows how to pull the bow, the composite bow you need to use as a horse archer. 25% of his officers are actually of nomadic Turkic origin or Mongol origin,
Mm.
speaking an Altaic language. Um, and he's successful because they can see him as a Khan of their own. But he's an exception. And that
Mm.
control over the nomads lapses soon after his death because later Chinese emperors just don't have the charisma and the military ability to maintain that loyalty of the tribes.
Mm.
And you get the reassertion of Turkish Khanates, eventually the Uyghur Khanate, and you have this division where when the Tang Empire falters, the northern zones fall under the control of Sinified nomads. The southern areas are in the hands of the Mandarins. And that division of China persists for over 400 years. And one of the points about writing this book is I gained a new admiration for Kublai Khan.
Hmm.
Genghis Khan, the Mongols love him as their great national hero.
Yeah.
Kublai Khan is despised by the Chinese as an outside conqueror. The Mongols think of him as, well, he's too really Sinified to be one of ours. And the only people who like him are the Westerners because of Marco Polo.
Right.
And
Yeah.
Marco Polo had to write that book in order to recover his financial losses by getting home and losing all of his money. And he's
Right.
dictating it in a Genoese prison, being translated into French.
Right.
Talk about publishing in order to make up your bad business ventures. But Kublai Khan unites China for the first time in 400 years. And the Chinese never really forgot that. And the wall you see today, the massive masonry wall, is built after the Mongols are expelled. And it's almost as if it's a signal this will never happen again to China. We'll never let an outside nomad conquer China again because we're going to build this incredible wall structure.
Talking about this, so I love the Kublai Khan, how you give his treatment in the book, but there's this interaction you were talking about it here. You're talking about Bao Chao in West China and their interaction with the Uyghurs, and you've been mentioning it throughout the conversation here. I mean, obviously we know the tough situation for the Uyghurs in China today. I mean, in 2024, and that's been ongoing for many, many years. Is there just a long history of some type of suspicion or dislike for, the Uyghur people, or for them because they're nomadic, or because of, now that they're Muslim, or is I mean, not that there's a direct line going all the way back 2,000 years, but Has it just always been kind of contentious in China with the Uyghurs for 2 millennia? I mean, what's the
Yeah,
what's what's
I
the
think that
thread
is,
there?
and it goes back to the decision of Wu Di, the Han emperor, who determined that we're going to reckon with these people. And I mean, there's two strata. One is to defeat the Xiongnu on their own territory, which would be
Hmm.
Mongolia. And
Hmm.
repeatedly, armies are sent across the Gobi Desert to do that, and the losses sustained are just staggering. And the price of waging this war is just so costly. But also at the same time, they are aware, because of now they have accurate information of what's to their west, because of Zhongqiang, who returned. When the emperor saw him, he's like, "Oh, you have been away for 8 years. What's happened?" I mean,
Mm.
um, that they need to control that region where the Uyghurs live today, the Tarim Basin. At the time, that would have been inhabited by people speaking Tocharian languages and probably Sogdian, a East Iranian language, which was brought by merchants coming from um, the eastern Iranian zones, which today would be Uzbekistan and parts of Turkmenistan.
Mm.
The
Mm.
cities of Samarkand, Bukhara,
Mm.
Balkh, the great caravan cities of the Silk Road. They would have been a mixed population. There would have been cities on the northern and southern rim of the Great Desert in the center of the Tarim Basin. And the need was to control those zones, those cities, and the routes, which would then converge at Kashgar, which is now at the western end of the modern Chinese Republic, which then lead into the caravan cities.
Mm.
Um, this would give you access immediately to Fergana, where the best horses are. It would allow you to tax and regulate the trade along the Silk Road, which was very lucrative. You would control it at Kashgar at the western end, and then that would all come together at the Jade Gate, which would be the entrance into China proper.
Mm.
Wu Di is insistent that these western regions, as they're called, would have to be secured with Chinese military garrisons, uh, with the imposition of tribute on the cities, the acknowledgement of the emperor, and the pushing of nomadic peoples out of the picture. This was a tall order, because not only would you have to defend against the nomads to the north, who would want to control these routes and tax it themselves. The Xiongnu would be very eager to recover those areas, but also the Tibetans on the high plateau, who would also have an interest in controlling at least the southern cities.
Mm.
And there would be traditionally very close ties between those cities and the peoples of Tibet through most of history.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
so this is a long-term struggle on the part of the Chinese regimes to control that western region,
Mm. Mm.
Chinify it, to incorporate it into a wider Chinese empire.
Mm.
And
Mm. Yeah.
the current situation is the population is it's about half ethnic Chinese now,
Hmm.
and that's been largely due to forced migration.
Yeah.
Um, if the regime in Beijing ever weakened and lost central control, my suspicion is a lot of those Chinese families would just leave on their own
Mm.
choice.
Mm. Hmm.
Um, this is a forced assimilation,
Yeah.
is what's
Yeah.
going on.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, it's a tough situation, but I think what's particularly instructive here is the history is really important, because this doesn't just happen because of something in a modern period per se.
and,
It's there's a history here.
and the Terran mummies are really problematic for both the Chinese and the Uyghurs, because what it proved is these distant people are related to neither one in
Oh
any direct
gosh, yeah,
sense.
that's the irony here.
Linguistically,
That's the irony here. Yeah.
religiously, now I'm sure many Uyghurs have DNA going back to Tocharian ancestors,
Mm.
but starting in the ninth and 10th century, they adopted a Turkish language. They were Buddhists, or they were
Hmm.
first Manichaeans, they became Buddhists, and they finally became Muslims.
Hmm.
They've
Yeah.
changed their religion at least three times historically.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
Um, So,
Yeah.
you know,
I think the history here is super important. I mean,
it's very hard drawing national boundaries and national myths, as it were, historical
mm,
myths,
mm,
when you go back in time, especially to people who don't share your same view of these, nation states. We must all be descended from the same people. I mean, they didn't even have
yeah,
that concept. You're
yeah.
superimposing your assumptions on these people.
What
Um,
I think yeah, I totally agree with you on this. I mean, as I read more history and I talk to wonderful people about it, I look more now. I think nation states. I think there's some great things about them, but I think they do more harm than good in a lot of ways, maybe inadvertently. But I look at things now just as region. What's the region of, like, for example, I mean, this is a clear example, I think, in some ways complicated, but typically you can think of the Aegean peoples, right, from the Aegean
Mhm.
Sea. There's so much mixture for
Yeah.
so many years between West Turkey and the Greek Isles and things like that,
Mhm.
and even slipping into Bulgaria a little bit. Like a lot of these people, they're just sharing lots of different things here,
Sure.
and you see this in so many parts of the world where it's like, yeah, this is like a regional thing. Like this is, these people have the same, someone drew lines on a map somewhere, but that doesn't mean that their family wasn't across the mountain or someone came over here. And so now they're like, this. I mean, I'm sure there's some story of this as well with Pakistan and India, as, tense as that can be. I mean, you just see this a lot of regional kind of cohesiveness more so than just these like
Well,
lines that divide you by nation states.
Well, at the risk of, you know, getting irate messages, as an example of this, just think of how the states were drawn up after the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. A
Yeah.
group of senior European diplomats and leaders, in
Hmm.
which Woodrow Wilson was completely out of his element. He really was outclassed by Clemenceau and Lloyd
Yeah.
George, decided to carve up mandates in the former Ottoman Empire. And these are all students of classical texts. They all had read their Tacitus. Well, we know there's an Egypt, there's a Libya, there's a Syria, there's a Mesopotamia. So they simply drew these map lines, which are essentially Roman provinces, which have
Hmm.
very
Hmm.
little to
Hmm.
do
Hmm.
with the populations in 1918,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
represents centuries of changes and migrations and religious conversion. And there is a conversation at one point where terms are being dictated, and Ataturk is listening to this, and the Europeans are using classical names like Cilicia and Lake Ionia and all these. And Ataturk says, I don't know what you're talking about. I
Hmm.
mean, I never heard
Hmm.
of these places.
Hmm. Hmm.
But the Europeans, as students of the classical world, well, it's on the map. Tacitus said it's there. There should be
Right.
Assyria, and
Right.
let's call Lebanon what the Romans would call it's Phoenicia, right?
Hmm. 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 Hmm.
Jordan is it's Arabia Petrea. I mean,
Hmm.
even the term Palestine is a Roman administrative term,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
um,
Yeah. That's right.
and so you're drawing these nation state lines, and they're really very arbitrary. Uh,
Yeah. 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 I
and
mean,
then
I
you
mean, this
expect
is.
them to function like a European nation state, France or Britain, and those had evolved over centuries, and those were extremely painful experiences. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
the Provençal language got demoted to being bad French. I
Yeah.
mean,
Hmm. Hmm.
even today in Germany, I don't know, there's a set of German languages spoken within the boundaries, but what's spoken in Frankfurt is hardly what I understand in Dresden. And uh,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean,
um,
it's a strange thing where you start to see where people, outsiders. I can understand some element of trying to, okay, there's a war, and how do we put it together? But
mhm.
at this time, I mean, it wasn't, well, let's talk to people that are there. It's more of we're going to say how we're going to do this, so that way it makes it easier geopolitically or whatever. And I don't know. I think some of the ripple effects, and then people get very this is, and this is a little bit off topic, but this is where when people start to really lean into nationalism, I just don't find it very convincing in a lot of ways. I mean,
Yeah,
this
I
is
would
not.
draw a distinction for myself, between patriotism and nationalism.
Yeah,
I,
yeah, yeah,
I, I am patriotic. I do love my country and what it potentially represents, and even
Yeah.
though it doesn't fulfill its potential many times, nonetheless, we shouldn't stop trying, as opposed to the nationalism that fueled the great wars of the 20th century.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and that those are the most destructive wars we've ever seen on the
Yeah.
globe.
Yeah.
The
Absolutely.
wars waged for those sort of
Yeah.
national ideologies. And again, it goes back to 19th century assumptions that language represented race, and
Yeah.
it never did.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, the spread of the Indo-European peoples, to get back to the nomads, or the emergence of empires built by charismatic figures such as Attila, Genghis Khan, and Tamerlane, these are all multilingual
Mm-hmm.
organizations, um, and loyalty to the ruler counted, being a member. One of the best examples, I think I cite it in the book, is the envoy to Attila the Hun, Priscus of Panium, who arrives as a diplomat for the Eastern Roman Emperor Theodosius II. And when he finishes his mission, he meets a fellow there who speaks excellent Greek. He's from the Eastern Roman world, speaks Greek, not Latin, and realizes he's a Roman. And he burst. He said, "Why are you living like a Hun?"
Mm-hmm.
And he said, "Well, um, the laws are harsh, but they are fairly um, implemented, which is not true in the Roman Empire. It's very corrupt at the time. And furthermore, loyalty is rewarded. And yes, I was capped, but I rose in rank in the service of Attila. I have a wife through him and rank, and I do agree that Roman law in its abstract is a brilliant achievement, but the application of it is such that I rather live with the Huns who have accepted me as one of their own."
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very, very telling story of how these nomadic peoples would often attract all sorts of people to their service. This was very true of Genghis Khan and
Mm-hmm.
Kublai Khan, who could win over Kittians and Uyghurs, Tibetans, and even eventually Mandarin, some of the Mandarin Chinese elite of South China, to serve the Mongol Khan as the emperor of China. Um, they were able to co-opt Muslims from the Iranian world as bureaucrats, as technical engineers, as physicians, as savants to the court, um, because they had skills. And that's the whole success story of Marco Polo. Now, he exaggerates his position undoubtedly in the Mongol hierarchy, but he would have been seen in 1275 when he presented himself. He was 21 years old to Kublai Khan. His father and uncle had promised to return, and they brought Marco along, and he had learned a number of languages and enough Mongol in order to understand the protocol. And he was employed for the next 17 years as a traveling official to look out for the Great Khan's interest, and was very successful and eventually allowed to return home. Um, there's a practicality about them that you have to see that to offset the stories of conquest, the massacres, the brutality that we usually associate with them, which are the rules of war in a very, very harsh age.
This
Um,
so what you're highlighting is what I love about the Mongols is I think it's probably Marie Favreau who wrote that wonderful book on the Horde that really turned me on to it is yeah we talk about conquest and pillaging and killing and it's really grotesque and we know that story, like that's, I'm not trying to be dismissive about it. It was pretty
yeah,
barbaric. Obviously that's okay. There's, I think when you know that, and sure, you should always mention that, but that's fine. But that's, historically, it's kind of boring after a certain point. It's like, okay, we know this, we know that, we know what's going on. What other things do they do? And also, if you look at a map of the Mongol Empire and the various hordes, and you look at, this is pretty much the entire world. Um, how is that possible? And how is that possible for so long? You can't just do that by killing people, right? Like,
no,
sure, you can do some
no,
of that way, but
no.
how are, and then when you start digging into it, you say, well, oh my goodness, like there's all these different people groups, and oh my goodness, there's all these different cultures, and there's these different regions, and we're talking millions of miles, in the 13th century, whatever it is. How did they do this? And you start to see the absolute tremendous administrative power the
Hmm.
Mongols had, and how organized they were, and how multi-diverse and inclusive they were in a variety of ways. How they handle one of the fascinating things about them is that how they handled internal conflict, which at a certain point became more, I would say, salient than external conflict.
Hmm.
How they did. I mean, obviously they were imperfect, but that level at that time with administrative prowess is tremendous to me. I think it's tremendous. I mean, and, this isn't three cheers for Empire necessarily, but maybe one and a half cheers for Empire on this bit, because it's a masterful feat. And when you look in the modern era, we we can't even do elections right, right? So it's like there is some respect, I think, that is deserved for the Mongols, for the Ottomans. Again, the Ottomans, 600 plus years. How do you do, and even much more impressive is they do that during the revolution of the printing press and people becoming literate, and a lot of spread, which has pros and cons to it. And these things are very complicated, but I do think that there are some pretty masterful feats that were done here in these empires.
Well, if you were, one of the UFO visitors to the Earth, and you arrived in the time of Kublai Khan, let's say 1275, 1280, you obviously would see the Mongol Empire as the future of this planet.
Yep.
There's nothing else that comes close to that in, say, the year 1280, where Marco Polo is acting as apparently a customs official for the salt monopoly of, of Kublai Khan. And yeah, give the Italian that job with, he's pretty good in his Mongol. And we've got plenty of Chinese scribes to help him out if he gets stuck. And I suspect that's how it was done. But can't prove it, but it ought to be true. In any case, it clearly is. And the genius of that Genghis Khan is the fact that he was followed by such extraordinary successors, which is seldom the case in any family. His grandsons, he could communicate to them a vision of an imperial order, which was
Hmm.
implemented by his sons and grandsons
Hmm.
uh,
Hmm.
on a scale that has never been equal. It's the largest continuous empire ever to be constructed.
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
and embraced many of the great centers of earliest civilizations. Um, it is extraordinary that it lasted as long as it did.
Yeah.
The distances, the problem of communications, there was always the danger of a succession crisis when the great Khan died. It teetered on the edge of civil war on several times, and Kublai Khan had to fight his way to a civil war against his younger brother. It ended rather quickly by 1260. He clearly was going to win it, and then turned around, and completed the conquest of China. It's an extraordinary achievement.
Mm.
Um, so this is again their practical outlook. It came with religion, so long as these whatever the religious beliefs of those who submit it, so long as they are loyal to the Khan, they recognize Yasa, his law, we can permit their religious services.
Mm.
And you have these cases recorded where they actually invite debates among Christians and Muslims and Buddhists over the faith. And the Mongol princes are very curious to hear about that. And you have the earnest Christian missionary like William of Rubric, whom I talk about, who arrives at one of the Western Mongol courts, and he has a rumor. Well, he's Christian; he's going to be on our side, right?
Hmm.
And and
Hmm.
he introduces him, and he's politely told, "Yes, I'm a Christian." He's actually probably a Nestorian Christian, but I'm a Mongol first.
Hmm.
You know,
Hmm.
that's that doesn't have anything to do with my loyalty to the Great Khan all the way over there. No, no, I'm a Mongol.
Yeah.
And this tolerance is really quite extraordinary. Uh,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Especially, I always see the Middle Ages as marking a period in Western history, not the rest of the world, but in Western history, where the Roman concept of citizenship is replaced by a religious definition of
Yeah.
identity. And it's in the 17th century, after the 30 Years' War,
Mm-hmm.
that Europeans begin to go back to that Roman identity when they realize if we keep killing ourselves over religion, no one's going to survive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And um, so for the Mongols to have this religious toleration in the Middle Ages is certainly from a European perspective is quite unusual.
Yeah. 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 I
All
fully agree.
Europeans at the time would first and foremost identify themselves as a Christian, and what
Mm-hmm.
kind of Christian?
Yep. 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 Yep.
Do I
And
represent the Pope in Rome? Is it the Patriarch?
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That would be the first thing they would tell you.
Yeah, and I mean, again, it just speaks to, and on this element, how ahead the Mongol Empire was, and how do you coalesce groups of people together under something that isn't going to be terribly divisive. I mean, there are always going to
Mhm.
be, shortcomings, but it's very, 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 very powerful. So the one last big topic I want to ask you about, because we've mentioned it, but I want to
Mhm.
definitely give it its due and get your thoughts on it, is the Orkhon Valley in Mongolia. I mean, it's a pretty wonderful place. You can describe it if you'd like, and talk about Khagan. He was a huge figure, and talk about the Eastern Turks, how they arose from this region. Many nomadic peoples came from here. We've mentioned the Altaic language. There's the Gok Turks, all these things. And then there's one thing I want to ask you about specifically, is this 5 branches about
Mhm.
how Turkish speakers, we talked about this earlier, but they have the Uyghurs branch, right?
Right.
And they have all of these separate ones. Talk about how that comes about and how it starts here in this valley, and all these different peoples.
Well, as I said, our earliest inscriptions are in this magnificent valley, which was always seen as a sacred place, close to the eternal Lord of the Blue Sky, Tengri.
Have you been
Probably,
there? Have you been there personally or no?
no, I have not,
Oh man,
unfortunately.
I've always wanted to go.
I certainly would be on my list as I get older and time runs out.
Yeah.
I've had 2 knee replacement operations as a result of falling down on too many archaeological sites in Turkey
Oh,
for
yikes.
5 years.
Big yikes.
Um,
Ugh.
but I wouldn't give up the experience
Yeah.
of crisscrossing. I know the peninsula very well.
Mm.
But in any case, it was always a sacred landscape, I'm sure, going back to the first nomadic peoples who couldn't help but see it that way.
Mm.
And that would be a natural instinct of most humans, that certain areas are so spectacularly beautiful, it must be the hand of God or a divine
Mm.
hand behind it.
Yeah.
And as new groups move in, as the Uyghurs left after the sack of their capital to relocate to the Tarim Basin and Mongols moved in, those that remain would teach them why this was the sacred place. This is where we should have our major assemblies to acclaim the Great Khan in 1206 or whatever.
Mm.
And that would be the natural setting for it to take place in the spring. Um, the languages that evolved there, the Turkic languages, are first discernible in the 8th century AD, and these languages are carried west and southwest to various locations due to migrations. And in the process of doing it, the languages diverge. Um, Turkish languages were brought into Europe, particularly in what is now Bulgaria. The Bulgars were originally Turkic speakers. They eventually gave up that language for a Slavic language when they converted to Christianity.
Mm.
Many settled in the regions that became Russia, the Principality of Moscow. Again, many got assimilated into the Russian population over time. Conversion to Christianity would be the first step. There are still some um, Turkic speakers who are Christians,
Mm.
Um, in fact, the American actor Charles Bronson
Hmm.
um, traces his ancestry back to Turkic Christians settled in the old Lithuanian duchy.
Interesting.
Um,
Interesting.
uh, and well, that's a remote ancestry of his. May explain why he was so good in those action adventure films. I loved him in The Magnificent Seven, if that doesn't.
Of course, yeah, of course.
And in the case of the Oz Turks, the
Mm,
groups that gave rise to the modern Turkish of Turkey and Turkmen and Azerbaijan, that was the most successful transplant of the language because there those communities flourished and assimilated populations and they became a dominant form of Turkish. Um,
What? Why?
so
Why do? Why is that one? Do we think? I've heard this before as well. Why? What is it about that branch that makes them the most successful? Is it just we don't know, or why is there was so much success that it carries through?
well, it's interesting to also stress that the Safavid dynasty that made Iran Shiite and created the basis of what is now modern Iran and its
Hmm.
aspirations to be bigger,
Hmm.
was based on the power of the Kizilbash, the Red Turbans,
Mm,
who were Turkish speaking nomads.
mm,
So Iran itself, as we conceive of it, although you can get into trouble, I mean, the military basis of it rested on Turkish cavalry.
mm,
Um, and you had the situation that the Turks who moved into Anatolia were heirs to the Persian administrative system, and due to various complicated political situation, they could turn Asia Minor into a Muslim Turkish speaking land between the 11th and 14th centuries that
mm,
became the basis for the Ottoman state. They conquered a second heartland in the Balkans, which they have now largely lost.
mm,
And with that, they were on the cusp of the military revolution of firearms. That in the 16th century, the Ottoman army was one of the best armies in the world.
mhm, mhm,
And proved it in its ability in siege warfare. Um, and they had various ways. I get, the co-opting of the Christian population to furnish young men for the Janissaries in the 14th and 15th and 16th centuries was again a system of it's a blood tax. It's taking children of the conquered and turning them into your soldiers, slave
mm,
soldiers. Um,
mm,
so the Ottomans organizationally depended very heavily on the organization of the very effective Muslim states you see in Iran and Eastern Iran, which is today Central Asia, which the Turks adopted those institutions.
mm,
Um, and they were able to settle in Anatolia and flourish because the grasslands there were very similar to what they knew on the steppes.
mm,
And they entered a world in which the Byzantine Empire had been largely wrecked, compliments of the Crusades.
mm, mm,
They
I see.
profited from. Constantinople wasn't, it was captured in 1453 by the Turks, but the city and the state was essentially destroyed in 1204 by members of
Hmm.
the Crusade.
Hmm.
And that opened that area to some kind of new order would emerge. And the question was, would it be an Orthodox prince in the Balkans or a Muslim sultan in Asia Minor? And it turned out to be the latter because they had the better resources and organizational skills. And again, a succession of very, very talented rulers.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So the final question here is obviously many things we didn't get to cover, which is a good excuse for people to go and buy your wonderful book. But the question I have is how do or how have nomadic peoples continue to leave their mark on the current world? I mean, if you talk to someone parachutes into Istanbul right now, and you know that what are the traces they're going to see of some of these nomadic peoples. I guess I should say if they go to Central Anatolia, or if you go to Uzbekistan, or if you go to even some of Bulgaria, or what are what are the ways in which we see nomadic peoples influence even until modern times today?
Well, it's both positive and negative.
Mm,
In Turkey, for instance, if you go to the Museum of Anatolian Civilizations, which I've worked at for many years, in the marvelous gardens there, where all the curators and staff have lunch, you will see reproductions of the early Turkish monuments from the Orkhon Valley,
mm, mm,
prominently on display,
mm,
and a consciousness in the Turkish population that somehow we are all origins to these people.
mm,
That makes them very proud of their language. It makes them very intent on learning about the different Turkish nationalities. It sometimes can lead to, ludicrous and silly television series and the like. But it's very, very conscious in shaping the Turkish identity of their history.
mm,
The same would be true in Uzbekistan, where they've claimed Tamerlane as their national
mm,
progenitor.
mhm.
Um, it's the same in Mongolia, where Genghis Khan clearly has
Sure,
monuments everywhere
sure.
and can't be disputed. It's because of the nomads that East Asia oriented on Buddhism, um, and it's because of the Turks that Islam would dominate in the central steppes in Uyghurstan,
Mm,
and that the religious landscape that we see across Central Asia and East Asia are historical products of the effect of these nomadic empires.
mm,
Um,
mm,
those would be obviously important geopolitical uh,
mm,
ties. The
mm,
people in Mongolia feel a spiritual tie to Tibet, which is
mm.
very strong, and they're undoubtedly concerned about what might happen to them under the regime, um,
Sure.
in Beijing. Um, it certainly explains very much, excuse me, the perceptions of any regime in Moscow.
Mm,
The notion of a Mongol yoke um, still resonates in Russian national histories. Explains why, since the time of Ivan the Terrible, that every ruler in Moscow makes sure to be on the forefront of military technology, and we're never going
mm,
to suffer a conquest again.
mm,
They have
mm,
beaten off many invasions from the West, but the only successful conquest for the Russians was Batu and the Mongols,
mm,
and the
mm,
long tributary status that the Russian principality suffered under the Mongol yoke, as they call it. Now, there were a lot of benefits to being part of the Mongol Empire; those are conveniently, forgotten.
mm,
Um, so those are just part of it. The other, changes in technology across Eurasia, leading to the gunpowder revolution, um, that was only made possible because of the Mongol conquest. The transmission of knowledge and
mm,
technology across Eurasia in the 13th century is unparalleled.
mm,
It led to, block printing,
mm,
use of paper money, um, uh, the development eventually of artillery and then handheld firearms, all as a result of the cultural and intellectual exchanges brought about by the Mongols. A better sense of the world and geography.
mm,
Um, the Mongols probably had the best idea of what their world looked like of anyone because of their constant contact with other civilizations, the frequency of merchants showing up to market their goods. So they shape a great deal of what the modern world looks like. And it's almost inconceivable that the modern world as we know it would have flourished without those nomadic peoples to keep the civilizations in Europe, Eurasia, in touch with each other.
mm, mm,
Um, the fact that we like wearing trousers as males.
mm,
Well, you develop trousers to ride horses. Romans and Greeks didn't wear trousers; those were
mm,
barbarian.
mm, mm,
Those were barbarian qualities, and the importance of the horse as a status symbol, and
mhm,
everything associated with the aristocratic ethos that goes with it.
mm,
I always think of the Emperor Taizong, who is much happier riding around with his cavalry than dealing with his Mandarin ministers. and his tomb has his 6 favorite horses included in it, with their names and everything, their details, and that's a tradition right out of the nomadic world.
Mm.
I would hope that the notions of toleration that accompanied many of these empires would be a lesson we learn.
Yeah.
That more than anything,
Mm.
and also their pragmatic skill in adapting to conditions, out of a need for survival. They always anything they took, they tempered in a practical way. Ibn Fadlan, when he goes among the early converts to Islam on the Volga River, which is now Russia, was shocked that these Turks, they don't sequester their women. The women are
Mm.
still walking around and managing things. Well, in nomadic society, you don't sequester women because you need all the help you can get
Mm.
uh, to get anything done. And the tales of women warriors, starting with the legends of the Amazons and running all the way through the Mongol period is just one testimony of that on their attitude towards the sexes, which can be very different from urban societies where women often are secluded and subordinated to just very very
Mm.
specific roles.
Mm.
Um, so there's useful lessons
Yeah.
to still gain from them
Hmm.
in reading the historical record, and all of it is a humbling experience as a modern to understand that people distant from you, they may not be literate in the sense that they read and write, but they can achieve so much
Yeah.
given their technology and are perfectly capable of adapting to the modern world if they were brought here and informed on how
Hmm.
life had changed.
Mm.
Just because they are earlier, it doesn't mean they are dumber.
Mm. Mm. Yeah. No, I like the way you put that. I think that makes a lot of sense. So there's obviously a
This
lot of
is why
genius.
I became devoted to classical literature because of the insights
Mm.
that text 28 centuries ago, 25 centuries ago, can still speak to you
Yeah.
directly about the human experience.
Absolutely. No,
Mhm.
absolutely.
And studying this, you know, doing this book was a real revelation for me because it wrenched me out of my Greco-Roman world and
Mm.
forced me to look across a wide range of history and different peoples and really gain an appreciation not only for them, but even an understanding of my own field and my own time.
Mm.
And that's what history does.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's very very well said. I fully agree with you. I think that's the crux of it at the end of the day. Ken, thanks so much for coming
Okay,
on.
well, I enjoyed it very
This
much.
was so much fun. Yes, I absolutely love this stuff, and your book was great, and I just like getting all your wisdom here. So big thanks.
Okay, well, I'm always willing to answer questions should you have them.